Usually, when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision, right?
Oh, yeah, like totally binary.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
You think of it almost like engineering.
Yeah.
You break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen. The doctor just points at it and says, there is the problem.
Right. It's visible. It's a structural failure. The bone is broken or it's intact.
Right.
And we get a lot of comfort from that, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
Because it gives us a really clear path to a solution. You passed it, you isolate it, and, it heals.
But the moment you step out of the hospital and into the world of human society, of culture, collective psychology, that whole X-ray machine just shatters.
Oh, completely.
We're suddenly looking at a diagnostic landscape that is just incredibly murky. And we have this massive stack of sources on the table today, historical documents, biographical notes, and one truly monumental philosophical text. And the overarching mission of this deep dive is to figure out how you diagnose a sickness that you can't physically see.
Yeah, it's a huge question.
Like, how do you measure the starvation, not of a physical body,
Yeah.
but of a culture?
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, the metrics we normally use, GDP, life expectancy, technological advancement, they don't capture it.
They don't, no.
And that is the colossal task we're taking on today. We are examining one of the most radical, unsettling, and strangely prophetic diagnoses of the modern condition ever put to paper.
We are diving into a text by the French philosopher Simone Weil. Specifically, we're looking at her essay, The Needs of the Soul, which actually serves as the foundational first part of her larger book, The Need for Roots.
Right.
I'm going to unpack her philosophical blueprint for human flourishing, starting with the absolute basics of how we structure society, all the way up to her incredibly controversial ideas on modern media and politics.
Yeah, it gets intense.
It really does. But to understand the weight of this diagnosis, we have to look at the doctor who wrote it. The context of Simone Weil's life is, well, it's almost impossible to separate from the words she put on the page.
Oh, the context informs every single syllable she wrote.
Yeah.
So the setting is London, 1943. Simone Weil is a French Jewish intellectual, a brilliant philosopher, but she is the furthest thing from an ivory tower academic.
Right. She actually lived it.
Exactly. She had previously taken leaves of absence from teaching to work incognito in automobile factories.
Which is just wild for a philosopher of her standing.
Totally wild. But she did it just to understand the physical and spiritual toll of mechanized labor. She even fought in the Spanish Civil War.
Wow.
Yeah. And by 1943, she's living in exile, working for Charles de Gaulle's Free French movement, which is, trying to organize the resistance against the Nazi occupation of France.
And while she's in London, surrounded by relative safety, she's making a profoundly drastic personal choice.
Yeah.
She is purposefully restricting her own food intake. She refuses to eat more than the official rations that her countrymen are surviving on back in occupied France.
Which is it's devastating.
She's essentially starving herself in solidarity.
And that self-imposed starvation is actively exacerbating a case of tuberculosis that will, very shortly after she writes this text, take her life.
She was only 34, right?
Only 34. She is drafting this philosophical architecture literally from the edge of life in the shadow of the catastrophic, humiliating collapse of the French state in 1940.
Right.
She's trying to answer why France fell, not just militarily, but spiritually.
And the craziest part is the Free French leadership gave her what they probably thought was a standard bureaucratic assignment.
Yeah, just a policy brief.
Right. They asked for a post-war reconstruction policy, like a memo on how to organize the government, fix the roads, and set up the courts once the war was won.
Right.
Instead of a policy brief, she delivers this staggering, almost unclassifiable work.
Oh, yeah.
One of our sources refers to it as testamentary axiomatics.
Which is a great phrase.
It is. It blends ontology, psychology, sociology, and morality into a single cohesive system.
Yeah. T.S. Eliot wrote the preface to the first English edition of the book, and he captured her unique position brilliantly.
What did he say?
He noted that she was an absolute outsider to conventional politics. He described her as being more truly a lover of order and hierarchy than most people who call themselves conservative, and simultaneously a more genuine lover of the people than most who call themselves socialist.
Wow.
Yeah, she completely dismantled the traditional left-right political spectrum.
Well, let's start dismantling where she starts dismantling.
Okay, let's do it.
To understand her diagnosis of modern society, we have to follow her structural logic.
Wow.
We can't just jump into her critiques of 20th century politics or media. We have to look at the foundation.
Right, the bedrock.
Exactly. And she begins by taking a sledgehammer to the bedrock of Western democracy.
She really does.
If we imagine society as a building, the architects of the French Revolution in 1789 and the American Revolution, for that matter, declared that the foundation of that building is rights.
The rights of man, human rights.
Right. But Weil argues that starting with rights is building a civilization on sand. The true bedrock, she insists, must be obligations.
Her ontological reasoning for this reversal is profound. Rights, she argues, are inherently subjective and conditional.
Conditional how?
Well, a right is entirely dependent on someone else recognizing it. If you're granted a right by a constitution, but the people around you or the state apparatus refuse to acknowledge it, that right is functionally worthless.
Oh, I see.
It doesn't exert any real force in the world. Rights belong to the objective world, the world of changing political climates, power dynamics, and facts on the ground.
Okay, I'm trying to visualize this. If I have a piece of paper that says I have the right to free speech, but the government has locked me in a soundproof box, the right is essentially a fiction.
Exactly.
It requires a receptive audience and an enforcing authority to exist.
That is the exact vulnerability Weil is targeting. Obligations, however, are fundamentally different in her framework. Obligations are eternal and unconditional.
Okay.
They exist above the fluctuating conditions of this world. Weil paints a very vivid thought experiment to illustrate this.
Walk me through it.
Imagine a human being left completely alone in the universe. No society, no government, no other people. That solitary individual would have absolutely no rights whatsoever because there's no one else in existence to claim those rights from.
Right.
A right requires a claimant and a provider, but Weil argues that solitary human being would still have obligations.
I need to push back on this because it feels like we might just be playing a semantic game here.
Okay, lay it on me.
If I have an obligation to not harm you, doesn't that automatically mean you have a right to not be harmed by me?
Right.
We're describing the exact same transaction, just looking at it from two different sides.
Right.
Why does it matter which word we put at the top of the philosophical hierarchy?
It matters deeply because of the psychological and cultural identity it creates. While they might look like the object and subject of the same transaction, prioritizing one over the other forces a massive shift in how we view ourselves. When a society starts with rights as its foundation, individuals are trained to act as isolated consumers. We spend our energy demanding what we're owed, measuring our grievances, and looking at our neighbors as potential infringers on our territory.
Oh, wow.
It breeds a culture of perpetual claiming.
Okay, that shifts the lens completely. If we start with obligations, I'm no longer a consumer demanding my due. I'm a moral agent.
Exactly.
My primary orientation is outward, focusing on the responsibilities I'm bound to uphold toward my fellow citizens, simply by virtue of them being human.
That is the critical pivot. The obligation is owed to the human being just because they are human. It's not conditional on their usefulness, their citizenship status, or their intelligence.
Right.
And Weil uses a very visceral, universally understood duty to model this entire philosophy, the obligation to feed the hungry.
She traces this specific duty across vastly different cultures to prove its eternal nature, right?
She does.
She looks at the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, where a soul attempting to justify itself before the gods in the afterlife explicitly states, I have never let anyone suffer from hunger.
Yeah.
She points to Christian scripture, quoting Christ saying, I was an hungered, and ye gave me no meat. There's no historical era or moral framework where a person is considered innocent if they possess abundant food and simply walk past a starving person on their doorstep.
Exactly.
That primal obligation to feed the physical body becomes her model for all eternal duties.
And Weil establishes that baseline to make a crucial leap. We universally recognize the catastrophic damage of physical starvation, but Weil asserts that the human soul has vital needs in the exact same way the physical body does.
Oh, that's interesting.
The soul requires specific nourishment. If it's deprived of these needs, the soul experiences a very real, very destructive form of death, even if the physical body is perfectly healthy.
This is where we have to be careful with definitions because modern language blurs these lines a lot. When she says needs of the soul, she is drawing a hard boundary against desires, whims, or fancies.
She draws a very stark line. Needs have intrinsic limits. Desires are bottomless.
Right.
Weil uses the analogy of a person eating. A man eating bread eventually reaches a point of satiety. He's had enough. The physical need is fulfilled and limited.
Makes sense.
But a miser hoarding gold never reaches a point where he has enough. The desire for wealth, for power, for status, these have no natural stopping point.
Like, they just keep going.
Exactly. Therefore, they are desires, not needs. When Weil maps out the architecture of the soul, she is strictly talking about limited foundational requirements that must be met to prevent spiritual decay.
And the structure of these spiritual needs is fascinating. She doesn't just present a laundry list. She says these needs exist in antithetical pairs.
Right, opposites.
Opposites that must both be satisfied. And she is very clear that this is not about finding a watered-down, compromised middle ground where neither side gets what they want.
Right, because the concept of the golden mean is often misinterpreted as a tepid compromise, and Weil despises that approach.
Oh, she hates it.
She compares the soul's antithetical needs to the physical necessity of food and the interval of time between meals. A human body needs food to survive, but it equally needs the time between meals to digest.
Sure.
If you constantly force food into a stomach without a break, you destroy the digestive system. You don't solve this by eating a tiny continuous paste all day that satisfies neither need.
Ugh, that sounds awful.
Right. You need a robust meal followed by a distinct period of fasting. The soul operates on similar dualities. The contrary needs must each be fully satisfied in their turn.
Well, let's dive into the actual needs she identifies. She starts with what she calls the highest need of all, order.
Yes, order.
But considering she's writing this while fighting against Nazi Germany and fascist regimes, she obviously does not mean a totalitarian police state.
No, absolutely not. Authoritarian control is the perversion of order. By order, Weil means a specific texture of social relationships.
What does that look like?
True order exists when an individual is never forced to violate one imperative obligation in order to carry out another.
That is a profound way to define it. When society forces you to choose between two profound duties, it inflicts spiritual violence.
Exactly.
I'm thinking of a modern scenario, a parent who has a deep obligation to care for a sick child, but also an obligation to maintain their employment, to provide for that child.
Right, a classic modern dilemma.
If an unforgiving corporate structure forces them to abandon the sick child to keep their job, society has failed to provide order. The person's love of the good is torn in half.
That is the exact spiritual violence she's diagnosing. Weil compares a perfect social order to the mechanics of the universe, or the composition of a beautiful work of art.
Okay.
In the physical universe, you have innumerable blind mechanical forces, gravity, electromagnetism, momentum that could easily result in pure chaos. But they're balanced against each other by an overarching architecture to create a unified, functioning whole. Human society should mirror that delicate, complex balance rather than relying on blunt coercion.
That brings us directly to the next vital need, which sounds like the opposite of order, but in her framework is deeply connected. Liberty.
Right, the pair.
But again, she strips away our modern consumerist definition of liberty. She says liberty isn't about having an infinite menu of choices.
No.
Liberty is the ability to choose, yes, but it is fundamentally about the internalization of sensible, straightforward rules. My thought here is how we interact with everyday dangers. We don't feel our personal freedom is violently oppressed because society doesn't allow us to purchase food laced with arsenic.
Right, of course not.
Once you learn the rule that poison is bad, that rule becomes part of your internal logic. You navigate the world freely within that boundary.
Wallace is operating on a very Augustinian definition of freedom here. Freedom is not the ability to do whatever you want. Freedom is aligning your will with the good.
Okay, I see.
When rules are sensible and aimed at the common good, internalizing them doesn't feel like a restriction. It feels like navigating a well-lit path.
Yeah.
However, this is a point where Weil's philosophy encounters significant friction with modern democratic pluralism.
Oh, how so?
Her theory of liberty assumes a universal consensus of goodwill. It assumes we all agree on what the sensible rules are.
Which we clearly do not.
Yeah.
Who gets to decide which rules are sensible? If a citizen genuinely disagrees with a state rule, say a zoning law or a tax policy, Weil's framework leans dangerously close to suggesting that the dissenter simply lacks goodwill.
Right.
Or is behaving like an adolescent who hasn't internalized the truth. It leaves very little room for legitimate structural dissent without labeling the dissenter as spiritually deficient.
It is a valid vulnerability in her argument for sure, and that vulnerability becomes even more apparent when we transition to her next need of the soul, obedience. Weil categorizes obedience as a vital food for the human spirit, but she draws a razor-sharp distinction between genuine obedience and mere servility.
She defines true obedience as consent. It's consent given to established rules and to leaders. It is not submission driven by the fear of punishment, and it is not compliance driven by the hope of reward.
Exactly.
If I'm only following the law because I'm terrified of going to prison, or if I'm only doing my job because I want a bonus, I'm not practicing obedience. I'm operating as a slave or a mercenary.
Weil argues that modern populations are fundamentally starved of genuine obedience. They're given various forms of slavery instead.
Wow.
Because modern political and economic leaders predominantly rely on force, the threat of destitution, or the promise of financial gain to keep the machinery of society moving.
Right, carrots and sticks.
Exactly. They don't cultivate a system where people can offer genuine, dignified consent, and she adds a critical caveat for this to work. In any healthy hierarchy, those who command must also be seen to obey in their turn.
Oh, so the leader can't be a tyrant.
Exactly. The leader must be a symbol who is visibly accountable to a higher moral architecture. The grandeur of that higher goal must be felt just as powerfully by the laborer at the bottom as by the executive at the top.
Well, if we're establishing this hierarchical structure where some command and others obey, that inherently forces us into a collision with the concept of equality.
It does.
How do you maintain equality in a system that relies on obedience to superiors? Weil tackles this, and in doing so, she unleashes one of her most ruthless critiques of modern liberal democracy.
Oh, yes.
She utterly despises the concept of equality of opportunity. We hold social mobility, the idea that anyone can become a billionaire or president, as the ultimate moral good. Why does she view this as a trap?
Equality, in Weil's strict ontological sense, means equal respect for the human condition across all individuals. But she argues that the modern fetishization of equality of opportunity destroys this respect.
How does it destroy it?
It creates what she calls an aspirator towards the top. Society broadcasts the message that with enough hard work and talent, anyone can reach the pinnacle of success.
Which sounds incredibly empowering on the surface.
It sounds empowering until you look at the psychological reality of those who do not reach the top. If society guarantees equal opportunity, and you still end up in an inferior economic or social position, the system leaves you with the crushing, inescapable bitterness of knowing it was entirely your own fault.
Oh, wow.
Your failure is a reflection of your own incapacity. Will argues this strips away human dignity. It breeds profound depression, resentment, and even criminality because the individual is told they are fundamentally less capable than the successful.
By telling everyone they have an equal shot, we accidentally engineered a system where the losers feel completely worthless and the winners feel entirely justified in their arrogance.
Exactly. It's a toxic psychological trap.
So how does she resolve this? She doesn't want communism, where everyone is forced into identical material conditions.
No, she advocates for a concept she calls proportion. This is how she harmonizes equality with inevitable human inequality.
Okay, what is proportion?
Proportion dictates that the burden of responsibility and risk must scale geometrically with power. She uses a very concrete legal example. If a wealthy employer commits a crime against a vulnerable worker, that employer should suffer a significantly harsher punishment than if the worker had offended the employer.
That completely inverts our current reality. In modern systems, the rich and powerful usually possess the resources to insulate themselves, resulting in a slap on the wrist, while the poorest bear the brunt of the punitive system.
Precisely. Weil states that because the employer holds more power, wealth, and societal influence, they must carry a heavier burden of moral risk.
Right.
The exercise of important public or economic functions should carry serious personal jeopardy. If you wield power, your mistakes should cost you dearly. That is true proportion. It maintains equality of respect while acknowledging vast differences in capability and station.
This proportional view relies heavily on a pre-modern, almost medieval understanding of society as an organic body, which leads into her paired needs of hierarchism and honor.
Right.
She believes we have a spiritual need to venerate superiors, not worshiping them as individuals. She isn't talking about celebrity culture or cults of personality. We need to venerate them as living symbols of the realm of eternal obligations.
Honor is the spiritual nourishment derived from feeling connected to a noble tradition. Weil points out that one of the most devastating weapons of oppression is the creation of a famine of honor.
Famine of honor, that's a powerful phrase.
It is. When a people is conquered or marginalized, their heroes and traditions are systematically erased. She notes that Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who led the rebellion against Julius Caesar, was no hero to his Roman conquerors.
Right, he was paraded as a captive and executed in a dungeon.
Exactly. To the Romans, he was a nuisance. To the Gauls, he was the embodiment of their honor, which was crushed.
She doesn't just look at ancient Rome, though. She points the finger directly at her own country.
Oh, she's very critical of France.
She calls out the deep hypocrisy of the French Republic, suppressing the saints, heroes, and traditions of their Annamite and Arab colonies. When an empire denies a colonized people their historical heroes, the empire is actively starving the soul of that population.
And this systemic starvation trickles down to the everyday life of the individual. Weil spends a significant portion of her essay examining how these vast philosophical concepts dictate the reality of the daily grind.
Yeah, how does this apply to regular life?
She argues that personal responsibility and initiative are indispensable needs of the soul. An individual needs to feel that they are a useful, active participant in the machinery of society.
She gives a brilliant, challenging example regarding unemployment. She says that even if a modern welfare state manages to perfectly feed, clothe, and house an unemployed person, that person is still being spiritually starved.
Right.
Their material needs are met, but they lack initiative. They represent nothing in the economic life of their community.
And this spiritual malnourishment isn't limited to the unemployed. Weil observes that employed manual laborers suffer a similar fate if they are treated merely as cogs in an industrial machine.
Okay, how so?
A worker tightening the same bolt on an assembly line for 10 hours a day without any understanding of the final product or the social value of their labor is being degraded.
I see.
To nourish the soul, a worker must be brought in on the intellectual and communal value of their work. They need to comprehend the greatness of their contribution to the whole.
This need for initiative is deeply intertwined with another antithetical pair, security and risk.
Yes.
The human soul requires security. It cannot function under the permanent weight of terror or extreme precarity. Weil uses the chilling historical example of a Roman master who casually keeps a whip resting on a table in the hallway.
Right. He doesn't even need to use it.
Exactly. Just the latent ambient terror of its presence keeps the slaves in a paralyzed, half-dead psychological state. Constant fear is a paralyzing poison.
However, the complete eradication of risk introduces a different, equally lethal poison. If a society manages to remove all physical, economic, and social risks, it introduces a crushing, suffocating boredom.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The soul requires deliberate risk to exercise courage. It needs a challenge that it can deliberately react to, a situation where the outcome depends on the individual's initiative and bravery without being so overwhelming that it induces terror.
We see that paralysis of initiative perfectly illustrated in her views on property.
Oh, this is a big one.
She asserts that private property is a vital need of the soul, but she completely divorces the concept of property from money and capitalism.
Yes, completely.
For Weil, property is a psychological necessity. It is the need for the human spirit to feel organically connected to the physical world.
A person needs to be surrounded by objects and spaces that feel like extensions of their own body and effort. A gardener who has spent years working a plot of land, understanding its soil, and nurturing its plants, needs to feel that the garden is theirs. It's a biological and spiritual synthesis with the environment.
But the modern, mechanized state aggressively destroys this connection. She points to the massive factory system and absentee ownership. It's a spiritual wasteland for everyone involved.
Yeah, totally.
The laborer works a machine they will never own. The manager oversees a process just to collect a salary. The board of directors rarely sets foot on the factory floor.
Exactly.
And the shareholders, who legally own the property, might not even know what city the factory is in. They just look at a ticker symbol. Absolutely no one's soul is nourished by that kind of property.
She draws a hard line here. Making money the sole measure of all things has poisoned our understanding of ownership. And she balances this by emphasizing the need for collective property.
Okay, like what?
The civic pride derived from public monuments, grand gardens, and communal ceremonies. Even the most destitute citizen should feel a deep spiritual sense of ownership and pride over the beauty of their city's architecture. That shared splendor is vital spiritual food.
We've mapped out this incredibly delicate, complex ecosystem of the soul. Order balanced with liberty, security with risk, equality with hierarchy.
Right.
This leads to the major pivot in her diagnosis.
Yeah.
If the human soul requires these precise, delicate balances to survive, how does the massive mechanized apparatus of a 20th or now 21st century state accommodate them.
According to Weil, it fundamentally does not.
It just crushes them.
Yeah, the modern state, by its very design, acts as a mechanism that crushes these delicate balances. It operates through mass media, propaganda, algorithmic manipulation, and rigid political structures.
Right.
While she was observing the rise of totalitarian regimes like the Nazis and the Soviets, she explicitly directs her critique at Western democracies, arguing that their structures also starve the soul, just through different mechanisms.
This brings us to what is undoubtedly the most controversial, shocking, and difficult part of her entire philosophy: her views on freedom of opinion and the media.
Oh boy.
She makes a hyper-specific distinction between theoretical thought and practical influence.
Yes. Weil argues that pure theoretical speculation must be granted absolute, unlimited freedom. A philosopher, a mathematician, or a scientist should be allowed to write down any argument, no matter how offensive, absurd, or terrible, purely as an intellectual exercise, with zero legal or social consequences.
Intelligence needs absolute space to explore.
Exactly.
There is a massive but coming.
But the moment a publication aims to influence human conduct, the daily newspaper, political magazines, popular literature, broadcast media, she categorizes these not as thoughts, but as acts.
Okay.
And just like physical acts, such as driving a car or practicing medicine, they must be heavily regulated and restricted if they cause harm.
She is incredibly harsh on writers who play what she calls a double game. She specifically names the famous French author André Gide. Gide wrote a novel called Les Caves du Vatican, where a character decides to push a complete stranger off a moving train. Not for money, not out of anger, but just to see if he's capable of committing a completely gratuitous act.
Yeah, nihilism.
Weil points out that Gide was fully aware that his novels were deeply influencing the youth of France, inspiring them to embrace nihilism and act out in reality. Yet, when confronted, Gide hid behind the shield of art for art's sake.
Right?
Lacan essentially demands to know why a writer should be given a free pass to inspire real-world violence simply because they package it as literature.
She argues that modern writers, journalists, and media figures have eagerly claimed the societal role of directors of conscience, effectively replacing the priesthood.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. They want the cultural power to shape minds, but they absolutely refuse to accept any moral or legal responsibility for the destructive orientation of their influence.
If you think her stance on novelists is intense, her solution for the political sphere is staggering. She genuinely advocated for the complete abolition of all political parties.
Yes, completely. This is where she echoes the political philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Weil views political parties not as vehicles for democratic expression, but as centralized machines designed for a single purpose: to manufacture collective passion.
Right.
They exert a relentless disciplinary pressure that forces the individual to surrender their independent intelligence to the group. She argues that the moment a person starts thinking in terms of the little word we believe this, we oppose, that human intelligence is defeated.
Her argument is that political parties don't want you to think. They want you to toe the party line. If a member formulates a genuinely original thought that contradicts the platform, they're treated as a heretic and expelled.
Exactly.
Therefore, she concludes that public life would be infinitely healthier if it were entirely free of partisan organizations. Even when discussing trade unions, she says they should exist strictly to protect wages and physical working conditions, but they should be legally barred from ever touching ideology or political theory.
It is a radical vision of total decolorization. But it stems from her foundational ontological belief that intelligence resides only within the individual human being.
Okay.
There is no such thing as a collective brain. Therefore, no group, party, or collective can legitimately claim freedom of expression, because groups don't have minds, only individuals do.
This all builds to what she considers the single most sacred need of the human soul: truth.
Yes, truth with a capital T.
She claims that truth is constantly, systematically poisoned by organized lying in the press. We divide our media consumption based on our pre-existing predilections, and as a result, we're gleefully delivered over to error.
Yeah.
Her diagnosis of social fragmentation and media manipulation reads like it was written yesterday, diagnosing the exact pathology of 21st century social media.
It is remarkably prescient. She saw with terrifying clarity how suggestion, propaganda, and influence by means of obsession constitute a literal form of violence against the soul.
Violence against the soul.
It's a psychological constraint that doesn't require the physical fear of a gun or a whip, but it is violence nonetheless. When we look at modern algorithms designed to drive engagement through outrage, polarization, and the rapid spread of falsehoods. We're looking at the exact machinery, well warned, would starve the human capacity for truth.
Her diagnosis of the disease is brilliant, but her proposed cure for this media landscape is, to put it mildly, wild.
Oh, it is.
To protect the sacred need for truth, she proposes setting up special, highly trained, spiritually educated courts to legally punish authors and journalists for avoidable errors.
She envisions special tribunals. If a writer, a journalist, or a public intellectual publishes a material falsehood that they reasonably could have avoided with proper research, they can be taken to court.
Oh.
And if the tribunal proves there was dishonesty of intention, that the writer knowingly lied to manipulate the public, they could be sentenced to prison or hard labor.
She gives a specific example that shows how far she's willing to take this. She says the prominent Catholic philosopher, Jacques Maritain, should be indicted by one of these courts.
Right.
Why? Because Maritain wrote in a book that ancient thinkers didn't condemn slavery. Weil says, hold on, Aristotle explicitly acknowledged in his writings that there were thinkers in his time arguing against slavery.
Yeah.
So because Maritain got his historical framing wrong, Weil argues he should be formally censured by a truth court and legally forced to publish a retraction in every major newspaper and broadcast it on the radio, setting up a ministry of truth to throw writers in jail for getting a historical detail wrong. That is deeply terrifying to anyone raised in a modern democratic system.
It is intensely authoritarian, and we have to view it critically. On one hand, her diagnosis of the media's immense power to stupefy the public, orchestrate collective hatred, and parade material falsehoods without consequence is undeniably accurate. We live in the fallout of that reality every day. On the other hand, her solution relies entirely on a fantastical premise: the existence of a magical, incorruptible elite.
Right.
These judges would need to be naturally gifted with a wide, clear, and exact intelligence, receive an impeccable spiritual education, and possess a pure, unyielding love for the truth.
Which inevitably leads to the oldest question in politics: who guards the guardians?
Precisely. Her system offers absolutely zero institutional safeguards against abuse. If those truth tribunals are captured by a bad faith political faction, you have instantly created a totalitarian state apparatus for silencing dissent. Weil's diagnosis of the societal disease is brilliant, but her prescription demands that human beings act like angels.
As we pull all of these complex threads together, obligations, liberty, honor, truth, what is the ultimate takeaway from the needs of the soul? Weil provides us with a harsh, unyielding mirror.
She really does.
She reflects our modern rootlessness. She shows us exactly how we have structured our entire civilization to prioritize the physical body, the endless accumulation of wealth, and limitless individual desires, while completely neglecting the eternal spiritual needs of the human being.
She challenges everyone who reads her. She aggressively challenges the modern political left by vigorously defending concepts like hierarchy, obedience, and the necessity of order.
Yeah.
Simultaneously, she aggressively challenges the political right by ruthlessly attacking the pursuit of money, the psychological alienation of property, and the inherent abuses of unchecked capitalism and imperialism.
She doesn't let anyone off the hook.
She refuses to let anyone remain comfortable in their ideological camp. She leaves us with a framework that is very difficult to digest, but perhaps absolutely vital for diagnosing why our affluent, technologically advanced society feels so profoundly sick.
Which brings me to a final provocative thought. Something for everyone listening to mull over long after this deep dive ends. Let's go back to one specific need of the soul that Weil mentions, one we haven't unpacked yet, but which ties this entire framework of obligations and consequences together: punishment.
It is one of her most startling inclusions. She argues that punishment is actually a vital, foundational need of the soul.
She explains that when a person commits a crime, they have forcefully placed themselves outside the chain of eternal obligations that bind humanity together. And true punishment, she argues, is the only mechanism to weld him back again into the community.
Right.
It is an honorable, necessary reintegration. It shows profound respect to the criminal by treating them as a responsible moral agent rather than a broken machine. But Weil is clear. Punishment only serves the soul if it wipes out the stigma of the crime and acts as a definitive mechanism for education and reentry. So look at the reality of our modern cultural system. Not just the sprawling legal apparatus, but our cultural mechanisms of justice. Think about cancel culture. Think about public shaming on social media. The permanent, unerasable social stigma attached to a person's digital footprint.
Oh.
If Simone Weil is right that the deepest spiritual purpose of punishment is to formally, honorably weld a fractured person back into the heart of the community, how utterly does our modern system fail? We shame people, we cast them into the digital wilderness, and we leave them there forever. We offer no mechanism for the stigma to be wiped clean. We offer no path for the soul to be reintegrated. Are we, as a society, starving for a true sense of justice that we have completely forgotten how to provide?